First, I'll introduce you to our panel. First on my left is Eric Mazur, who is here from the US. He's a professor of physics at Harvard, and he also is a passionate expert in both science, of course, and the art of teaching. And he's done award-winning work in teaching science in an engaging and interactive way, which is known as peer instruction. And he's just told me that he never ever gives exams. He also holds 3 chairs at Harvard, including he is the chair of the Graduate School of Education. Then next to him, I'd like to welcome Kiana Strong, who is here from Wyndham Central College, which is an avid school. Kiana's in year 12 and she's had a very busy week doing various assignments and tasks that she has to do for her work. So thank you for coming along here this evening, Kiana. She's also the vice captain of Wyndham. Last year was the avid captain, and she has an idea of going on one day to study psychology and criminology. Next is Rob Rees, who is one of the UK and Australia's leading chefs and a social entrepreneur and passionate food campaigner, which we will hear a bit about, I'm sure. And Rob has actively worked in the corporate sector, in governments and charitable organisations on education, public health and consumer issues. And lastly is Josh Nestor, who's the education director at SEEK, and he's a senior executive in the company and who's worked on both strategy and execution in many parts of the world. And he today holds management and board responsibilities. So welcome all of you. And the format is, thank you very much. Okay, the format is that first of all, Eric will just speak a bit about what he believes about education. He's been in Australia for a few days now and done a bit of travelling around. He's been to universities and schools and classrooms and met students, and so I can talk about what he has seen there and how it relates to his beliefs about education. After that, Kiana will talk about her experience in school, and after that we're just going to have a free-for-all, which means that I'd like to hear questions from you. And some of you have already put questions in online, which we will go to. Now, if you have, however, you can't get internet reception here and can't add any more questions into there, that's fine, because you can ask directly out of the audience. So first of all, Eric, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Is this microphone on? Yes, good. So I thought I'd start by telling you something about myself. And then I'm going to try to provoke everyone here so we can have a lively discussion about education. So I was educated in Europe, and when I was, I think, around 5 or 6 years, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who was an engineer, gave me a book about astronomy. It was a children's book about astronomy. And I looked at this book and I completely fell in love with astronomy. I knew then and there that I was going to be an astronomer. You've heard from Tim, that's not exactly how it worked out. Anyway, so I maintained that passion for astronomy. You know, the 60s were the days that the US was shooting rockets to the moon, and the first landing on the moon in 1969. I had my whole room plastered with pictures of rockets and pictures of the moon and the planets. It had grabbed my imagination. So when I graduated from high school, I obviously followed my passion. I went to the University of Leiden, which in those days was a mecca for astronomy. It had some of the most famous astronomers on the faculty there. Well, it took no more then I think 4 or 5 weeks for my romance with the heavens to completely unravel. All of a sudden, it was no longer about the beauty of the universe, the planets, the Milky Way. No, it was all about putting numbers into equations, calculating right ascensions and declination. I was completely, utterly disillusioned. And I thought, I don't think astronomy is for me. Now, I was pretty good at physics in high school, so I thought, you know what, I'll go into physics. And so I transferred my major from astronomy to physics, only to discover a few weeks later that astronomy wasn't that different that physics wasn't that different from astronomy. And, you know, even though I'd enjoyed physics in high school, all of a sudden it became about, you know, sitting through endless lectures, and then memorizing things, passing tests, at which I was okay, but it was simply not intellectually rewarding. I'd already switched major once, so I didn't think I should switch a second time. I hung in there, and if it hadn't been for me having joined a research group in my 3rd year, that I would have, I think, finished my studies. So when I started joining a research group, I was no longer learning physics by learning about what other people had done in physics. I was all of a sudden doing research. I was learning physics by doing physics. I was learning physics by experiencing what a scientist experienced, uncover, you know, the beauty of the universe around us, seeing things that nobody else on this planet had seen before. And I poured my heart and soul into that, and well, I ended up not being an astronomer, but I didn't end that badly either. But if I reflect back on my education, I think I am now where I am, and I'm saying this maybe a little bit harsher than it should be, not because of my education, but in spite of my education. You see, I think there are 2 ways to look at education. One is as a passport to a job, to any type of job, whether it's secondary education or higher education. The other, more lofty goal is as a way of building a healthy, just, and thriving society. In one extreme, education is a filter, a sorting mechanism. You go there in society, you go there. In the other, it's a pump to lift every single child, every single student as high up as possible. Well, I clearly did not pass the sorting mechanism to become an astronomer. And again, I said, I ended up okay. But I think that unfortunately, most of the model of education that people have is this common denominator of a filter, not a pump. As you heard, I've thought a lot about education. I've taught at Harvard now for 35 years. And a number of years ago, I read a book that had an absolutely beautiful title, Who Owns the Learning? So I picked up that book, and an anecdote, the book is by Alan November, who is a consultant for K-12 education, elementary and primary and secondary education. And in the preface, he recounts something that happened to him in the early 80s. You may remember, early 80s, the introduction of the PC, and Apple was the Macintosh. It was the emergence of the personal computer. And he was a high school teacher at Lexington High School, which is an affluent suburb west of Boston. And being an affluent public school, it was one of the first schools in the US and probably in the world to have a computer classroom. He was in charge of that classroom, and sometime during the first year that he was in charge, on a Sunday morning, he gets a phone call from the Lexington Police Department. There had been a break-in in the computer classroom. Would he please come to the school to punish the perpetrator? He lives about half an hour away from Lexington, so gets into his car, not his idea of a relaxed Sunday morning, drives to the school, parks his car. He looks at the windows of the computer classroom. None of them are broken. He goes inside the school. The door to the computer classroom has not been forced open. He opens the door, he looks inside. All of the computers are there. There's just one strange thing. There's a student sitting at one of the computers. So he goes up to the student and says, "Gary, what are you doing here?" And Gary looks up at him and says, "I want to learn how to program the computer." And that's when he realized that if somebody wants to learn, they'll do anything. They'll break in, they'll break the law in order to satisfy the desire to learn. So he actually realized that rather than punishing Gary, he should actually reward Gary. And he told him, take the computer home. Gary was actually a struggling student and then later became a computer science major at the University of Chicago because he followed his passion. Now, it's an interesting point, right? Because think about small children, 4, 5, 6 years old. They don't stop to ask questions about the world around us. We're wired to learn. You, I, everybody is wired to learn and is curious about the world. And as a result, we don't stop asking the question, why? Why? Of our parents, of our teachers. And if anything, education does a really good job turning that innate desire that we're all born with off. And by the time students get to secondary school or higher education, it's no longer about the why. It's about, give me the information so I can pass the test. And from then on, education is a complete filtering mechanism. And the whole situation is aggravating by the way we assess our students in education. I'm talking about exams. Think about the last exam you took. You still have a couple of ahead, right? You come into a room. You're separated from each other. You're not allowed to talk to each other. You're not allowed to look anything up. You're not allowed to bring in a calculator or your phone. I heard that for the SAT exams, which is the admissions exam to the university in the US, you're not allowed to bring in your watch anymore because it could be a smartwatch. Soon they'll have to take these exams naked. Anyway, they're cut off from each other and they're cut off from any other information because that's exactly how they're going to work later on in life. That was a joke, by the way. Can you remember, for those of you who have graduated and have gone on to a career, any situation where you've been equally isolated from each other and cut off from any source of information? I don't think so. The way we work is by talking to each other. By the standards of a typical exam, I have cheated and I'm still cheating my way through life. I continuously talk to other people. I continuously look up information. How can we imagine that what we measure by isolating people from each other and cutting them off from information, we're measuring something that is relevant to how they will function in society later on? You function together, not alone. Education is completely focused on the individual. So how can we solve that? Well, that's a long story. We'll talk about that hopefully more. But basically, one of the things that I've tried to do at Harvard is sort of to restore the ownership of learning by not focusing on content. Rather than giving my students a textbook and telling them, here, learn this, it's good for you. I tell them, I push the content aside, so to speak, and I tell them we're going to work on a really exciting project. And I try to add a component of empathy or social good to the project. And when they're really excited about the project, I tell them, here, you may want to have a look at this book. It might help you with your project. So rather than making the content a goal in its own right, it becomes a vehicle to accomplish a goal that's much more meaningful and connects to the students' passions, rather than being some kind of an abstract goal that may or may not make them better citizens in the long run. And in terms of assessment, there are two aspects to an assessment. One is ranking. The other is feedback, right? I mean, this you're doing well, this you're not doing that well, you could improve here, this is fantastic. That's the feedback. And then the ranking is, this is your grade. And then you can compare yourself to others, and you end up with a ranking. She's the best student, and the next best, and so on. Research has shown that if you add a grade to assessment, students ignore the feedback. They're completely focused on that grade. If you omit the grade, students take the feedback as an opportunity to improve learning. I would argue that the ranking that we give them is meaningless. In fact, no employer would ever go by a transcript to decide whether or not you hire somebody. You interview the person. Plus, I can think of a lot of people who I always looked up to in college or in high school who had fantastic grades. I have no idea where they are now. And I know a lot of people who are at the bottom of the class or even dropped out and have become spectacularly successful. At Harvard, we have quite a few of those. Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg. Steve Jobs was not one of our graduates, but he also dropped out of college. So what does that tell you about grades? They really don't reflect on people's future success. So my recommendation is to not focus on content, but focus on the development of skills, and to forget about this idea that we can successfully measure and rank people, and instead to focus on feedback to the learner.
Thank you very much, Eric. Now, Kiana, we'd like to hear from you because you are actually in the school system now and experiencing this. So what do you think?
So what I want to say really goes on really nicely of what Eric had to say. My experience with the education system, it's really only focused on one sort of learner. It's the person that can remember all the definitions and being able to answer questions in 60 minutes. But in reality, there are so many different types of learners, and the education system just doesn't cater towards them. A lot of people who don't learn in that way drop out, or they do non-scored, which means they don't do their work to get a score, which means they can't go to university. So it really restricts their ability to do what they want to do just because they don't learn in that specific way. And education, I feel like it's become more about, like what Eric said, the mark, not really the learning. So as a Year 12 student, I have to remember all this content, and I'm not really focused on what I'm learning. It's how do I answer the question, not what I'm learning, but how do I answer a question so that I get full marks, so that I get well on the exam at the end of the year. So for me, if I really want to be more in charge of my learning. I want to do what I want to do, and I want to learn because I can learn, and not because I have to remember this specific definition and how to write it in this specific way to answer this specific question. So I feel like the current education system takes away from that. Something else that I'd like to mention is, the end of year exam. We put so much pressure on it. I don't know if any of you guys know much about the VCE system, but it all goes towards that one end of year exam. So 13 years of schooling, doesn't really matter what you've done in those past 12 years. Even your SAC results, so that's your assessments, what you do throughout the year, they only matter this much at your end of year. Your exam, that's what's worth more. So if you have a bad day, or you're not good at remembering all that content or what you've learnt, you're only assessed on 10% of what you learnt throughout the year. And that really impacts on, what you're going to do in your future, because it's so focused on that one exam. So I would really like to see it more focused on what we're doing throughout the year. Like what Eric said, he doesn't focus on the exams because that's not really a reflection on how we learn. You know, we communicate, we talk. I know heaps of people in my school that they can tell you the answer, they can share it, they can verbalize it, but they can't write it down. They don't have those skills. And then they don't get, you know, a good result at the end of the day, but they still know what they're doing. They've still learned. They have that knowledge and they're able to verbalize it. They're able to talk about it, but that doesn't matter. So to me, that's a real barrier in our education system. It's not what you know, it's can you answer it in an exam. And like what Eric said, you know, we don't need that in the real world. That's not what we have to do. We're not isolated. We're able to talk. We're able to go on our phone. We don't have to remember all this information to write it down. And it's really, that's really difficult. And another thing is the competitive nature of our school system. It's the rank. It's the score. It's not about what you're learning. It's not, you want to be better than anybody else, you know, and it's really hard because you want to help your friends, you want to help out your peers, but you don't want them to get a better mark than you because, you know, they might get a higher ATAR and they might get the course that you want to get into. So it's really, I feel like we should focus more on that collaboration because in reality, in the workplace, you're working with people, you want to reach that common goal. You don't want to just be focusing on, okay, this is my stuff, I want to do this, you know, I don't want to help you. You know, even though we're working to the same common goal, I don't want to help you. And that I don't think that's what we should be teaching us. That's not how the real world works, so why should we be doing that for 13 years? Something else that I want to say. I had another point.
Well, it might come back to you,
Yeah.
and you can say it later.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Kiara.
you. Thank you.
Rob,
Yeah.
you work with young people, and you've worked with educating them and teaching them in fairly innovative ways. So what are your comments on what you've heard so far?
Well, first of all, when Claire asked me to come and do this, I was like, why? Why me? And actually hearing the two of you, I can see why. I'm driven by the development of soft skills amongst not just young people, but all people. And for the people that can't write stuff down, there are people out there that can really write things down, but would never be able to articulate it. So there's the flip side of that as well. So my work, majority of the time, is developing emotional intelligence, empathy, agility, lean processes, and developing people in collaborative ways. And we deliver that by having what we call an immersive experience. So kitchen is the experience that we have. It doesn't have to be kitchen, it could be construction, it could be anything. And then a blended model. So half a group could be from corporates, and the other half could be a community living with drug and alcohol addiction, disability, could be new arrivals. Or it could be in a school setting, it could be able, gifted and talented students blended alongside young people who, for whatever reason, are excluded from school or have, again, a community difference. And we treat them as equals, and we get them as individuals to step out of their comfort zones, and via transitional learning and a disruptive process in this immersive environment, we get them to collaborate. We clearly articulate to them what their vision should be. So it's a bit like you saying, isn't it amazing? If we could do this, we're going to have this a wonderful astronomy or physics results. So we set out a vision. Then we set out a purpose, and the purpose for them would be around connection. And we want to show them, we want to get them to feel what having purpose and what meaningful impact actually feels like, so that when they either leave school or they're working with people of difference in their community or in their employers, they understand how they can draw out the strengths, the asset-based approach to the individual. that's
Tell
what
us
we
how
do.
your program works, Rob.
It's 1 day a week for 6 weeks. No more than 12 people at any one time.
People are there in a kitchen and they are
They're in an industrial kitchen.
making food.
They're in an industrial kitchen, and we use academic processes around action learning, around reflective learning, all kinds of leadership theories. And rather than going heavily into the theory, we will put those theories into practice in practical environments. So I'll give you an example. So situational leadership. We all need to understand situational leadership so that when we are an employer, you know when you are directing somebody and when you are allowing someone to go for it and live the dream. So situational leadership would be delivered in the second hour. Very controlled, autocratic environment, very Gordon Ramsay. This is how you're going to make soda bread. 12 people in a room, some of them leading corporates. I'll only set one set of scales, 1 teaspoon, 1 sieve. So you can't move to point 2 until you've all weighed out 300 grams of flour. Trust me, this puts many people into a complete meltdown. It really does. But you're already starting to see the strengths of people maybe with high-performing autism who love actually that systematic control. And so if you haven't got that and you're seeing somebody who you've already maybe prejudged because of their autism flourish to being told, actually, I quite like this. Mm-hmm. You get many corporates who love it and think, God, I've just had half an hour off. I haven't had to think. And then you get the others who really want to think, well, hang on, there must be another teaspoon here somewhere. No, I don't want you to think. So what we're showing straight away via that autocratic process, do you think I get 12 identical loaves of soda bread? Absolutely not. They've all had the same ingredients, the same kit, and the same commands, 12 different products. It shows it doesn't work. We flip 10 minutes later to the complete opposite in the situational ladder, democratic process. There's 12 people, they've only just met. Here's all these ingredients. Let's have some lunch. You've got an hour. Off you go. Mm-hmm. Trust me, they produce an amazing lunch by finding their own way to solve the problems as a team. That's the first 2 hours of a 6-day program. Right. It goes heavily like that throughout. And they end up running a pop-up restaurant at the final day as their celebration of real Michelin standard quality. Great. But importantly, they are a really Lencioni's classic, healthy team, driven by purpose, collaborating, connected, and they can go and change anything they want after that.
Thanks very much, Rob. Josh, what have you heard here and what's it telling you?
Wow, okay. Well, I'm glad that Rob figured out why he's been invited. I'm not sure. I still haven't worked out why I've been invited, but I'm the education director for SEEK, and I've heard a lot actually. I've heard that purpose is critical. I've sort of got a little bit depressed listening to Kiana and the state of our current education system, and the myopic focus on that one exam at the end, and feeling that your life is over if you don't do well in that one exam. And I'm imagining those kids that perhaps don't do as well in numeracy and literacy as other kids, or maybe just didn't do well in those particular narrow 10% of areas that you get assessed on, or maybe just don't do particularly well in timed in exam type environments. And I'm thinking about the impact that has on that person, later in life, if they feel that they were dumb, or if they feel that, they weren't as smart as the other kids, because the system was trying to force them to be like all the other kids, just better, rather than be the best version of themselves. And so I kind of got quite sad about that. And clearly the system's not completely broken, because you're an outstanding person, and you would have survived, no doubt, despite of the system, to pick up on what Eric said. I completely agree with Eric's view around ownership. And the thing that was in my mind was, this question of engagement. If you look, I guess, globally at the workforce, which I do, about 2/3 of all people globally at work are disengaged in what they do. And I couldn't help but kind of think that, if you go right back to school and this problem of schools trying to force you to, to perform well in timed tests and not really caring about who you are as an individual and what you might be good at, if it differs from literacy and numeracy and taking time tests well, then the analogy I'm kind of thinking of is, if you're on the wrong train, then every station you then stop at for the rest of your life is the wrong station. And I think a lot of people actually are in that situation where, they probably didn't do as well at school as they wanted, or they didn't discover themselves fully at school. So they went to university with some half-cocked, half-baked idea of what they might want to do, probably influenced by their friends and family, and thought, well, if I've invested this much time, I may as well go on with it and go on to a career that maybe doesn't suit me. And at some point in life, I have a crisis, and I might be lucky and take a left field turn and everything will turn out well. But for a lot of people, they just keep going straight ahead. And so I think, I would love a system where what you do with purpose. You have a strong sense of ownership as a result, and you're really clear on the why you're doing something. I'm thinking of the Nietzsche quote of, he, although I'm sure he meant to include females as part of that as well. He who has a strong why can withstand almost any how. And I do think that it comes back to having a strong sense of being engaged in where you want to go, and therefore being prepared, having a system that allows you to explore your interests and your talents fully so that you can be the best version of yourself.
Thank you very much, Josh. Now we'll move on to the part of the program in which we talk and answer questions. And could we have the questions up on the board behind you, please? So some of you have put questions in, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Now, I understand also that you might not have connectivity here, so if you don't, I will certainly take your questions out of the audience. Now, but first of all, Kiana, if I could ask you, what is the level of enthusiasm in your school from students who are being educated under the system that we have at the moment? Do you think it turns them on and they are enthusiastic about learning?
Honestly, I don't think so. We only have a very limited, number of number of subjects that we can pick from.
Yeah.
And, sometimes you have to do them because there are no other subjects in that time slot. You could not be interested in it at all. And people, like I said before, we just want to pass. We just want to do as best as we can. We aren't really focused on what we're learning and the why we're doing it, why are we learning what we're learning. It's just really, how can I pass, how can I get the highest marks, and how can I get the best ATAR. So I think that really takes away the enthusiasm of learning that I really enjoy, but a lot of people don't.
Right.
And I remembered the point I wanted to make before.
Please go ahead.
It kind of fits in nicely with this. So education is really important to me. I love learning. I love going to school. But I also love doing a lot of other things. I'm a vice captain, so I've got valedictory, which is our graduation, to plan. I'm avid captain, so I do a lot of work in there. I was part of the school musical, which took a lot of work out. And I'm here tonight, which, you know, takes away from my studying and my schooling. But that's not considered in my ATAR when I'm into uni. It's just how I performed. So it kind of, I'm really hesitant, and I know a lot of other people are hesitant to do pretty much anything in this last year of schooling because they just want to focus on school. They don't want to go out with their friends. They don't want to work. They don't want to play sport anymore or do anything else because that takes away your time that you could be studying, and you need to study because you need to get that good ATAR. So that takes a lot of the enthusiasm out of, you know, enjoying your final year of schooling, being with your friends, because none of that is really considered. It's just that number that you get at the end of the year, and that's what unis look at. And I really wish that it was based on other things as well, because, you know, my ATAR probably could have been better at the end of the year when I get it. It probably could have been higher if I didn't do the musical, if I didn't do this, if I didn't, you know, do all the things I do for school captain. But they're things that I really enjoy, and my year probably wouldn't be as great as it has been without them. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Eric, you had something to say about this.
Yeah, it was on the... I was thinking how nicely what Josh said and what Tiana said just matched, right? I mean, Josh was saying about the lack of engagement in the workplace. I mean, look at small children in pre-K or kindergarten, 100% engaged. You go to an elementary school and there's maybe 80% engagement. You go to a high school, it's even less engagement. Why? Simply because you don't get to follow your passions, and you get assessed on some kind of an absolute scale that I think doesn't make much sense. It's probably even, in my eyes, a social injustice, right? Because if you can't cram for a test, or you just don't have the ability to satisfy those requirements, it affects your life in a very substantial way, and you don't even get an opportunity to develop your real passions. So I think that clearly illustrates how education is on a wrong track.
Yeah. Well, here I'll go to the question which has got most votes on the board behind. And it is, who are the greatest blockers to reimagining education and schools? Is it governments, educators, parents, economic drivers, or what?
Can I go first?
Please.
It's all of them, isn't it?
Yes.
It really is. But there's a context to it that probably all of those stakeholders need to really understand. I've only been in Australia 3.5 years. I spent many times around government departments, around the school food transition, post Jamie Oliver for the Blair government, and governments that came since. So my engagement with the education department was dealing with school food instead of it sat with the health department. It's the same here in Australia. The wrong departments are dealing with the issues. So I think government's there to enable us to be able to do things. Now, if there's a groundswell of movement that comes from young people like yourself, employers who are the ones that build up the economy, we know employers are asking for these soft skills. You just said the number of people that disengage, so it has to change. So I think the economy can drive the government to make it happen. That said, so I've got year 7 and year 8, and my conversations with them when I'm talking to their teachers are still relating back to when I was in school. So as a parent, I really need to be informed as to what the future could be and how it should be. And I have my passion, and I was so delighted I was delighted and depressed when my boy had his year 9 choices. I was delighted on one hand that he's chosen one elective where he's going to learn about purpose and impact in a model business and setting up that. But he wasn't going to go into cooking, even though he loves it, because it will affect his ATAR score. And I didn't know what my strategic questions to the school should be. And I'm sure there are other parents as well that just didn't know, how can I help? How can I help you, teacher? Because that's really what I want to do. I want to help the teacher to help my child.
I'm gonna actually respectfully disagree and add some spice to the conversation. And I think I can't say it's all of them on that list, because I think educators and parents absolutely have their hearts in the right place. Teachers teach because they love to teach, and they really care about what they do. There is variability of teaching quality, and that's one of the key inputs, one of the key drivers of overall outcomes. But certainly teachers care about what they do, and parents obviously care about their children. I think that let me step back. The system is the problem, the education system. And the system has been, defined really as one long university entrance exam to support an industrial model that's out of date. It was designed by a guy right down to the school bell, age-based, cohorts, classroom setup. The whole system is sort of, in a sense, limiting. And it's very hard for anyone to work within that system because it's so heavily regulated. So I would point the finger at sort of government, and I actually wrote down a quote here. This is from Lincoln, and Lincoln said that the role of government is to lift the artificial weight from all shoulders and afford all an unfettered chance, and to have a fair start in the race of life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the right purpose for the education system, and I don't think the system that we've got at the moment enables that to happen. And as much as teachers and parents and students want that to change, they can't do that without the government allowing that to happen.
Josh, you said something interesting earlier. If you don't mind, I'll just ask a quick question. As a follow-up, you said that most people don't like their jobs, which is true. So we're in a situation where we have a society where most people are not keen on their jobs, and most people aren't keen on the way they're educated. Are these two things linked?
Absolutely. Because, the thing is that I think it comes back to the question of ownership. And, if you are conditioned through school not to take ownership for your learning, your education, if you sort of follow the tide and you focus on really, getting the best score so you can muscle out your friends to get that spot at university, that doesn't set you up for, the competition and that sense of competition actually continues on into the workplace, unfortunately. And, this idea of career paths is all conditioned in that way. The problem is that, as we know, jobs are changing. And so we need to become much more self-determined in our careers. There's no doubt about that. Careers take all of these strange and wonderful turns, and the people that can embrace that do well. The people that can't, and that's unfortunately probably the majority, because they've kind of been conditioned that way through school. So I think school could actually condition you to be much more individual in your approach, and lean much more into your talents and your strengths. Intelligence is not IQ. There are 8 different kinds of intelligence, and that's Harvard research. And if you learn what your unique fingerprint is, then you're in a much better position, I think, to both learn effectively and with ownership and with passion and purpose, and to actually find what you want to do in life later. And I think they are connected.
Good. Eric?
Yeah, so I think I want to put a slightly different angle on it. In the US, things are not that different from here. And in higher ed, there is a very large number of institutions, including my own, that are private institutions, and where the government can't even tell us anything what to do. So they don't have a finger in the pot. I think that the answer to that very interesting question is along the lines of what you said. It's the system. We've created a system of interlocking pieces that all keep each other in place, even though every single piece would like to improve what is going on. The parents, the teachers, the schools, the politicians, everybody has their heart in the right place. But we've built a system with interdependencies that make it very, very hard. Let me give you an example. After I started to change my approach to teaching in the 90s at Harvard, I had a number of high school teachers who came and observed my class. They were physics high school teachers. And they asked me at the end of my class, you know, how can we better prepare our students for a class like yours in college? And I said, well, you know, why don't you forget about coverage, cover less, but focus on fundamental skills rather than trying to teach a college level course at a high school and sending your kids to college where they have to take the same course again. And they looked at me and they said, but we can't do that because the students have to take most of the students take a so-called AP, Advanced Placement course, in order to advance their chances of getting into the more competitive colleges. And the AP is set by the College Board and the Educational Testing Services in Princeton, which is which has people from many different colleges and high schools determine sort of admission standards for a college level course in physics and chemistry and so on. So I thought, you know what? I should really try to have an influence on this test because that is preventing the high schools to change. And I have my hands more or less tied because what happens in the high school determines what I must do in my class in order to, you know, repair damage and get my students to get enthusiastic about physics and so on. So I made sure that I was appointed to the committee that sets the test for the advanced placement. What happens is that three professors and three high school teachers come together 4 times a year in Princeton on the campus of ETS, the Educational Testing Service. And we sort of each bring problems that are candidate problems for future advanced placement exams. And I would bring my conceptual questions from Harvard, which were very different from the standard textbook problems that can be solved by rote memorization. They were word-based questions. You had to think to answer them. It was not memorizing an equation and putting the numbers in. And already most of my colleagues on this committee were not very comfortable with my questions because that was not the usual questions. But I managed to get a few on a candidate slate of questions. What ETS does is then they send those questions out to be tested on a large number of campuses. And then the next meeting, they would report on this testing of the new questions. I would come to the meeting, and the psychometricians, as they're called, would come in, and they would look at me, and they said, Professor Mazur, your questions are not good. I said, what do you mean they're not good? I used them at Harvard. He says, well, our good students don't do well on them. This is what they do. They take the new questions and intersperse questions that they've used for 40 years, where they have an abundance of data. And if a student who does well on the old question doesn't do well on the new questions, that means that the new questions are not good. Not that the old questions are bad, but the new questions are not good. It's like taking a supertanker, which is already hard to maneuver, and removing the rudder, so it can only go one way, straight. In a sense, that is the system that we've built. The ETS depends on universities. Universities depend on comes on the high school. The high school does whatever they need to do to please the ETS. It's like a vicious circle.
Very interesting. Thank you, Eric. Now, look, I'll take another question off the board. And in fact, I'm going to merge 2 of them. So, first of all, it's hard for a child to know what knowledge and skills they might need in the future. How do we guide them and support individual determination? We've also got a question that says, how should schools prepare children for the rise of automation? And I suspect these 2 are linked because part of preparing students for the future is about automation and AI. So let's go with that one. Who's first? Eric, okay.
I feel I've already spoken too much, but I'm happy. This is certainly something I've thought about a lot. And in fact, you alluded to that, right? That a lot of your tests, you're testing on memory. Or some tests maybe may test rote procedural problem solving. We live in an age where computers can do that type of thing. So jobs that will require memorization or that will require rote procedural solving are going to disappear because computers are much more patient and fast than the human brain. So if you think about thinking skills, with lower order thinking skills like memorization, understanding, to higher order thinking skills that go towards creativity, computers are making an inroad from the bottom. But most of our testing is at the bottom. We really need to move up and start to really train our students in higher order thinking skills, analysis, evaluation, creation, and innovation. That is important. However, education shies away from it. Why? Because it's very hard to objectively evaluate those higher order thinking skills. How do you evaluate creativity? You may think that something is very creative, but somebody else may think that something totally different is creative. And therefore, an objective ranked assessment is no longer possible. Yes, assessment with feedback is possible, but a ranked assessment is not. So I come back to the point I actually started with in my introductory remark. As long as we're wedded to using assessment and education as a sorting mechanism, it's going to be really hard to train students in the type of skills that are not going to be taken away by automation and information technology.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, look, I think there are, I've got, I guess, two thoughts in my head. One is compass, not maps. So, part of, I guess, someone developing themselves as an individual is learning to understand themselves and the signals inside themselves that are pushing them in different directions, which are generally aligned to their interests and their skills and their passions. And so kind of listening and learning to listen to that voice and leaning into those areas. And this concept of range finding, which is the second kind of, I guess, principle along with this idea of compass and not maps. But, for a certain duration, leaning into whatever it is that's of interest, and then having the flexibility or the adaptability to then stop, take a breath. It's a little bit like climbing a mountain. When you look around you, you climb the tallest mountain you can see now, but once you get halfway up, new mountains are now into view, and you have a decision to make as to whether you keep climbing the mountain you're on or go back down and climb an even taller mountain. And this sort of process repeats itself. And that process is actually directly linked to the number one skill that employers are looking for globally in terms of enterprise or 21st century skills, which is adaptability. So I think, teaching a person as an individual to lean into the areas that are calling them for as long as those areas are calling them, and for as long as there's nothing more interesting to lean into. And I think if you just continue to follow that process, it might take you longer to get where you want to go versus someone who already knows where they want to go and it's the right answer. But it's the most reliable way to get you to the tallest peak, through your lifetime.
Thank you, Josh. Now, we've got a few good questions up on the board, and I'll try and get through them as fast as we can because we are running short of time now. So there's a question here. There's a great emphasis on developing better ways to educate children, but on the contrary, there is a weakness in instilling educational values. So what is an educational value? Is there a weakness here, or are they things that children naturally have? Anyone want to have a go at that one? Yes, Kiana. Yeah, well, we'll Kiana first, and then you. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So, educational values, are they present in your school, or do you think it has to change in some way to improve?
There definitely needs to be some way to improve it. Like Eric's saying, we're all really curious as children. You know, we all want to learn. We're all curious minds. But when we get older, that kind of fosters into a more narrow kind of way of thinking. I feel like we need to focus more on the passion, the why, as many of you were saying, in order to really get people to feel as though they want to take charge of their learning. You need to teach different values. I think we need to focus more on why we're doing this. Is there a passion? I know at my school, a lot of people go to school because they have to. They sit in class and they write the notes because they have to. There's no drive, there's no motivation. And I personally go through times where I feel like, really, what's the point when I've got all these assignments coming up and I've got all this work, and I kind of lose the sight of what I'm aiming for. I'm like, I'm really just working towards a number. Is that really what I should be focusing on my time?
What lifts you up when you feel like that?
That's a hard question. My teachers down there, they always can cheer me up when I feel a bit down, because I know I always focus on what I want to do after I've got my mind set on going to uni and getting my degree so that I can make the world better for everybody else. And that really what drives me. But a lot of people don't have that, don't have those ambitions, don't have that drive, because the education system isn't suited towards them. They can't learn in that way, so they don't have that passion to want to, go to uni, want to do anything.
Right, thank you. Now, there was someone who wanted to say something about that. If you can say it quickly, sir, and with a loud voice.
Okay, I've got a loud voice.
Yeah, good.
I've worked with a lot of university lecturers, and I've found over the years that by having them shift their mindset away from how best can I teach my class to how best can I help them learn, then the whole mission changes.
Right.
And I think we lose, and you were describing that really well, the ability to encourage children to want to learn. School kids aren't going to know what their passion is in life. It's going to take years to get to a point where you start to realise what that is. But if we can turn it on its head and turn it into helping them enjoy learning, helping them learn, wanting to learn, rather than trying to teach them, I think that's got to be a major key.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. Now, one more question, which I think's a really interesting one. Schools are increasingly leveraging data and analytics. Are they looking at the right data? Are they using it in the right way and for the right outcomes? Anyone want to have a go at that one? Right.
We touched it a bit.
Because, Eric, in Australia we have a thing called the NAPLAN test, which students do every year. It's a standardised test across the whole country. Schools get very excited about it. Parents get excited about it. Governments get excited about it. And if students aren't improving, there's a national crisis. So is there really a problem here?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
By the way, you're avoiding the most popular question.
Which one is that?
Yeah, at the top. But anyway, so I think it's really hard to measure, to first of all define and to measure success in education. Really, really difficult. And most measurements are focused on things that can easily be measured, like the test that we've heard about. And I would argue in the modern workplace, those results are pretty meaningless. Much more meaningful would be how well do people collaborate, how creative are people, how good are they at solving real authentic problems, not problems that can be solved by rote. And those are hard to quantify. I would say any metric that is easily gathered, especially in the education arena, is not a useful metric. I would say it's actually a useless metric. So that's the problem. People are so focused on data, but I don't think this is easily quantifiable.
Look, I'm a huge fan of impact measurement as a social enterprise. That's what I'm judged on. Interesting, Claire opened up with announcing what the theory of change was for AVID and AVID schools. And so straight away, that's what you're measuring your impact on, is on your theory of change. So I think it's linked into values, it's linked into impact, it's linked into purpose. And the systematic change. You rephrase why it is that you're running the education process that you're running, and you change the way in which you measure. Even before we started, we threw in stuff around about lean data. You know, lean data is all about measuring what your customer promises and touching on your customer's point every single step of the journey, and reviewing and reflecting on what you're offering your customer all the way down the line. So, you know, who is the customer in the schools? Is it government because you're being judged by, and because that's where the money's coming from, or is it young people like you who are the people that are going to drive through the changes that we all need for the future?
Any more answers on that one?
Yeah, no,
No?
look,
Okay.
I mean, I guess the only thing to add there is that I think there's nothing to be scared of in collecting data and using tools, standardise, tools for measuring stuff, for standardised methodologies. There's no harm in using and reusing established tools and methodologies and ways of measuring. I think the key is to measure the right output, and really to pick up on what Rob was saying. I don't think today NAPLAN scores are the right measure or the right thing to test. If we could focus on a better set of outcomes more aligned to helping people learn and discover more of who they are, if that was what the measurable goal was, then I think it would, we'd be in a much better place.
Thank you. Now, one more question off the board, which is a popular one. For better or for worse, nothing ever seems to get done without a monetary incentive to do so. So how would you make the business case for transforming education? Now, maybe since you're in business, Josh, we'll go back to you.
Look, I think the way I would say is if you think about the exponential difference in productivity between someone who's engaged in what they do versus someone who's not engaged in what they do. So someone who's just going through the motions, what a difference in a result does it make when you as an individual are passionate and engaged and care about what you're doing versus when you're just doing it because you have to. Now scale that up to, your team at work and the company, and then go further and scale that up to the whole society. Just imagine the difference in output on every level: creativity, productivity, you name it, economic, social, etc. So, in my view, human resources are the most wasted resource on this planet. And meanwhile, we're not dealing with the big issues. So the business case for me is about productivity, and it's about the exponential difference in productivity when you're engaged in something than versus you're not. And we've already established that starts back at school. The other, of course, is, you just have to look at the way children are, this National Day of Action that kids have had around environment, because they cared about what's happening in the world and in the environment. They got out there on the street, and look at the passion with which they threw themselves into that day. And, all governments were sort of interested in was, oh, you're taking a day off school. But, they weren't being sort of... I think what was on display was, the energy, the productivity, the power that can be unleashed when you can, sort of deliver that engagement. So I think for me, that's the business case.
Eric?
And there's certainly a business case, and it's certainly true that investing money is good, but you need to know what to invest it in. And also, you mentioned result, and maybe here lies the problem. the result of education is something that plays out over a very long time frame. It's not you invest and you get returns. It's you invest and you get returns a generation later. A generation later. I can't think of any longer term investment. And I think people are really poor at taking decisions based on very long-term effects. We tend to look for immediate feedback. I recently read an article by Atul Gawande, the surgeon and author, on something called slow ideas, wherein he muses why certain innovations in medicine take off like this and others take forever. Case in point, in the mid-19th century, there were two huge advances in surgery. One was anesthesia, the other one was antisepsis. Of the two, probably antisepsis was the biggest one because it lowered the death rate from operations. The first demonstration of anesthesia was in 1847 at Harvard, actually, or in Boston at MGH, Harvard Affiliated Hospital. Within 9 months, all around the globe, all surgeons were using anesthesia. Antisepsis started with an article by Lister, a UK doctor, in The Lancet in 1860-something, I forgot the date. By the turn of the century, it had not yet been adopted to disinfect your tools. Well, tools, yes, but to change your clothing, to wash your hands, and so on. In a sense, at the turn of the century, it was still a badge of honor for a surgeon to wear a frock that was completely covered in blood, because that showed that you had worked hard. Why did one idea spread so slowly and the other fast? Well, it has two reasons. One is the problem, one solves a problem that's in your face. Anesthesia, right? I mean, you have the patient kicking and screaming. Whether a patient dies a month later after the operation, you might not even notice as a surgeon because you're no longer seeing the patient. The other is that one innovation or one idea made work easier. It's much easier to operate on a sleeping patient than one that has to be restrained by 3 people and who is kicking and screaming. On the other hand, antisepsis made work harder. You had to wash your hands in carbolic acid, and you had all kinds of things that made it just harder, not easier. Now think about education. The problem is not in our face. We've been doing the same thing for centuries, and we're okay. Yes, somewhere deep down we know that it's not optimum, but we're okay. The problem is not screaming in our face. And secondly, if we have to change education, it's not going to be less work, it's more work. So unfortunately, tackling education falls into the second category of slow ideas, not fast ideas. And before we invest money, we have to really study the psychology of adopting ideas and asking ourselves, what is the result that we really care about? Short-term test results, long-term well-being of citizens and society.
That's a great analogy, Eric. And doctors still don't wash their hands enough. But look, let's turn to you, because I know that not all of you are connected. So are there any direct questions? One down here, and I'm going to pass you a microphone. May I borrow yours, Eric?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. That was fantastic. My name's Frank Pateri. I'm a principal, merging 2 schools, but been a principal for about 6 years. And my last principalship was at a school that was prep 5-year-olds to year 9, which was 15-year-olds. And we didn't have that issue of the tail wagging the dog, of the results of the ATAR. So we were able to invest a fair bit of our energies into what you were talking about. As a passionate teacher, I think that we've come a long way to address a lot of the issues that you're talking about. And I wanted to just make a comment. Richard Branson's statement up there, and in response to the last thing you were saying, the investment should be in teachers. And that's going to be a long-term impact, because I've never come across a teacher that doesn't believe everything that you've spoken about.
Yeah. Thank you very much. There's another question.
Hi there, Sam Howe from Victoria University. So yeah, fascinating discussion. I've been loving hearing all about it. My question is really around, so we're all on the same page, as was mentioned before, around process skills, 21st century skills, and that we need to kind of abolish the content-driven teaching framework, I guess, if you like. So, and Eric's been talking a lot about creating these filters and how it's very hard to actually measure, you know, process-based skills. So I'm kind of after an ideal world for each of you, an ideal system in which we can be using these process-based skills in the classroom from kindergarten all the way through to higher education. Do we need to quantify it? Do we need to create these filters? What would your ideal system look like?
Yeah, actually, there we are.
So, I mean, first of all, I think we have to abandon a quantitative assessment and go more to a narrative assessment, right? So not saying this person got a B in my class, but have a number of different outcomes that you want for that class, and essentially, you know, measure that person's ability along each of those outcomes. Say, in my class, just to give you a specific example, it would be self-directed learning, content mastery, teamwork, and professionalism, and all of those have a number of different subcategories, like professionalism has ethics and punctuality and engagement. So at the end of my course, I sort of can tell a little story about the person. I can say she was really good at self-directed learning, and I can say what evidence I have that this particular student was good at self-directed learning. She might need to improve a little bit of her content mastery, but I'm not too worried about that because she's a good self-directed learner, so she'll be able to fill in the gaps on her own pretty quickly. She was a terrific team player. Here are some of the quotes from her team members, and you know, I can put in quotes. So you end up with a narrative that actually is much more informative than saying she got an 8 out of 10, or she ranked 2nd out of 90 students in my class, which, you know, if that were a really meaningful metrics, then employers wouldn't have to look at students, at future employees. They could simply go by the transcript, right? But we know that doesn't happen. You interview people. So I think that's probably what I see as one of the biggest barriers, that we're so stuck on a quantitative assessment in all of our courses rather than a narrative. Now, a number of places are doing narrative assessment. There are a number of universities and high schools in the US that have narrative assessment. One of the UC, University of California schools, UC Santa Cruz, in the 60s, switched from numerical grading to Santa Cruz. I'm tired here, to narrative evaluation. They gave up, and it's often mentioned because it failed. No, it didn't fail. The problem was that the graduates of UC Santa Cruz could no longer be compared to the other students in the other UC schools, UC Santa Barbara, UC Berkeley, and so on, because they did not make the switch, which shows, you know, we have this interlocking system. But I was recently at a high school in California, of which I did not know. I didn't know that they had adopted narrative evaluation. And I was there for a professional development day of the teachers, and I spoke about assessment, and I had everybody in the audience write down as many purposes of assessment as they could think of. And there were a couple of students from the school in the audience too, and they were very eager to give their opinion. I wanted to hear from the teacher, so I just ignored them. And as I ignored them, their hands rose higher and higher, and after a few questions, they were actually standing, and I said, okay, you know, what do you think the purpose of assessment is? And everything they said had to do with reflection. I like it when my teacher tells me how I can improve. It was really more about reflecting on their own learning rather than on any numerical ranking or anything. So I was totally surprised. And after my talk, I went to some of the teachers, and And I said to them, these students are great, you have to send them to Harvard. and the teacher got a big smile and says, we don't have any grades in our high school. So I think that's one big barrier to change.
Yeah, okay.
I have to echo that reflective learning. So we do that in our kitchen challenge. That's why it's spread out over the 6 weeks. It allows each participant to take the reflective learning from each narrative. So they do their individual, and then, as I mentioned before, that single, double, triple loop learning, particularly for any corporates that have taken part in the program, allows them to really rethink their values as an organisation, and they'll go back with that purpose, and it allows them to do that. So reflective learning is the biggest thing we could instill in our children.
And sadly, we are almost at 8 o'clock, but I reckon there's time for one more question if someone has one out there. Yeah, over here.
Hi, folks. Thanks very much to the panellists and Kiana especially. I thought you were really eloquent in the way you spoke. We've spoken a lot about the interdependencies of school into university, university into the workforce. There's a lot of research that has come out over the past few years about the gap between job-ready skills of university graduates. We've spoken all throughout this session about the importance of hitting an ATAR and how that's a real focus. Are we pointing at the wrong thing here? And is there a future where perhaps university changes to be more sort of micro-skill, micro-credentialed rather than long 3-4 year degrees?
Good question. Who would like to have a go at that one?
I guess I can have a go at that from the perspective that, I mean, yes, we are definitely focused on the wrong thing, or I'd say too narrow a thing. It might be the right thing for a small percentage of people, but for the vast majority of people, it's just too limiting. We're definitely doing, at SEEK, we're doing our best to change or disrupt the way university deliver degrees. So we are unbundling both the degree through our investments in Coursera and also FutureLearn, two of the largest MOOC platforms, sort of online university platforms globally. And we're working very closely with the Open University UK, which is, really the pioneer for innovative teaching of degrees via distance globally for the last 50 years. We're working with them on much more of a micro-credential driven strategy where, really you can choose your own adventure to some extent through university and create a more personalised university pathway and end up with a much more, I guess, an education that reflects you as an individual. And so it would be great if schools could sort of, I guess, take a leaf out of that book and prepare students really by helping those students determine and learn more about themselves. So by the time they get to university, they're in a much more informed position to be able to make decisions, because they're going to have infinite choices. It's no longer kind of a train track type approach. So it really does require, I think, at the school level, students to know themselves better by the time that they launch into that.
Thank you very much, Josh. And unfortunately, that brings us to the end. Our time is out, but I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think it has really sparked some ideas about what education ought to be if every child is to have a better future. So please thank our panel.
And it's my great pleasure to thank you, Tim, very much for controlling this panel. Not that they gave you a lot of trouble, but it got a bit tight there on one or two questions. But thank you very much for flying down from Sydney. I extend my thanks to the panel too. The joy of hosting one of these events is always, what do you get an illustrious panel like this in terms of gifts? And we tossed around a pen, and we quickly dismissed the idea of a pen because I'm sure you've got enough pens. Kiana, you were easy because we thought you need something to contribute to your studies. So this is a little something from us to do that. We are looking forward to where you become the next generation of people who change the world for us, and I think everyone would agree that you're certainly in the space to do that. So thank you for your contribution.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And to our other panel members, we have a piece of art. It's always fraught to buy people art, but I had the great pleasure of going to an avid school in Newman, Western Australia, which is right up in the Pilbara, 2.5 hours from Perth. And there is a community of the Indigenous people there called the Matu people, and they have an art gallery which is stunning. And so there was some children's art on display there, which was absolutely beautiful. And I have bought each of you a gift from the Matu people. And the artists are children, and I hope that you will enjoy them.